recent masterclass session we did at Langs Teaching for some of our team leaders around, originally I called it building psychological safety. I've tweaked it a little bit since then, because one of my realizations has been that, okay, you can put in the building blocks for psychological safety, but just because you've got those there doesn't mean you've immediately got psychological safety. It's really about creating the conditions that allow psychological safety to emerge. And it's something which you do over time. And that is a real big part of what we try to do with TED, really, is create the right conditions and then regularly evolve them, repeat that process, so that we can move closer and closer towards that positive team culture that we want. So the key learning points from today is to think about how team leaders can encourage that in the teams, but also how TED can be a big part of that and help to create that culture of psychological safety. So we've got quite a few toolkits in TED that are on this topic specifically. I'll share a few of those today. But what we're looking for today really is think about, okay, what is psychological safety? A lot of those things you've mentioned in the chat, how TED can support it, and how can team leaders practically put things in place to be able to work on this when maybe they do see some of those red flags, or how can they encourage those positive signs that indicate psychological safety is present. So I'll throw this question out. Pop this in the chat or put your hand up. Can anyone sum up how would you describe psychological safety? If you had to do that in a sentence or in a nutshell, how would you describe psychological safety to a team leader if you were talking to them about it? Any thoughts? Sure, there must be some ideas out there. Might be typing away a few of you, I can see. I'll keep moving while you're coming up there with those. But some of the things, oh, Wendy, you got in there first, thank you. Having trust in the team and trust in the manager. Yeah, definitely. Helen, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I was just saying it's like a shared, it's really hard to describe, isn't it? Like understanding, if you like, that I suppose if you mess up, take a risk, you're not going to be judged in a negative way. You know, people have got your back, that kind of thing. It's a trusted, safe environment.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think safe is that key word, and it is hard to describe, because it is, I think a lot of people put in the chat, it's about a feeling, and it's sometimes quite intangible. We mentioned some examples before we started the recording about, you know, signs that psychological safety isn't present, but often in isolation, those are things that can happen whether you've got psychological safety or not. You know, someone not speaking in a team meeting or in a feedback session could be a sign of psychological safety, but it's not to say if that happens they definitely don't feel psychologically safe. There could be other things in there. So it's really hard and intangible to try and sort of measure, I guess, psychological safety. Let's just come to the chat. Rachel, you've mentioned it's a posh way of saying people can feel comfortable and able to speak up. I like that. Yeah, it's a sort of the sort of textbook description of how people might feel in a team when it's not working quite well. Definitely agree with that. You said it can't be created in one moment or one room, but must be worked on over time. Yeah, absolutely love that, Rachel. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. It's not just a thing that you can switch on or say, now we've got psychological safety because we've got a policy or a guidance document on how to do it, or we're doing the right thing, so therefore we must have psychological safety. And I think sometimes that intangibility is what makes it really tricky for teams to be able to work on it, because there isn't a one size fits all way to getting it right. The answer, as with a lot of things in team engagement, can be different for different teams depending on the size of the team, the way that they work, the types of personalities that you have in the team. So absolutely agree with that. Wendy, you've mentioned feeling comfortable to speak up, not being judged. Yeah, definitely. Or not feeling that you're being judged, I think is a big part of that. And knowing that you'll be supported. Yeah, so having that supported. I think there's something in here around what we talk about in TED a lot, around having that shared purpose and understanding that even if you get a viewpoint which is in conflict to your own viewpoint, you trust that it's coming from that same spirit, that same direction to want the team to be the best that it can be. So I think there's a lot of that in psychological safety as well. Michaela, you've mentioned feeling safe to take interpersonal risk, whether that's speaking up, having a different opinion. Yeah, so it's feeling confident to be able to take a risk, and also feeling confident enough to be able to be challenged as well, and recognize that's coming from a place of being curious or wanting to learn together. It's not coming from a place of conflict as well. Helen, you've added, like trust, it can be destroyed in a matter of seconds. Yeah, and I think that's where it can be so challenging. And if we think about contemporary NHS teams and all the pressures that a lot of our teams face, the challenges under the strains and stresses of everyday work, that sometimes behaviours can slip, we can get it wrong because we're focusing on other things, that sometimes those interpersonal relationships, we do make mistakes, and that's where you might have built up a level of psychological safety. I think often we talk about trust is very easy to destroy, but it takes a while to sort of build up and to sort of create the conditions where it's there. So I think a lot of you have said trust in there, and I think it links to that very closely. So you've really answered a lot of the things I had here. So yeah, it's about feeling safe to speak up. It is about feeling safe to make mistakes and be able to own up to that and ask for support if you have made a mistake. A few of you mentioned about feeling safe to challenge, being able to offer a different opinion than what maybe the consensus is, or what strong voices in the team might have. Fewer silent issues, so there's no sort of elephants in the room, I guess, things that we just don't talk about. So it's about not having those sorts of things. There are no sort of restricted areas of conversation, and I guess the sort of perfect example of this will be a team that feels open to have tricky conversations, in the knowledge that it's not about pointing the finger at individuals, it's not about attributing blame, it's done in a way which is about understanding a situation and thinking about what's the best way we can navigate what might be a difficult situation for us as a team. So with that in mind, reasons why it matters. A few of you have alluded to this in your comments, but it absolutely leads to better performance. I think someone mentioned earlier, it's around you get improved productivity when you've got psychological safety present. You've got better learning. So I mentioned this continuous improvement. You're constantly evolving, learning from your mistakes if you're able to understand them and talk about them, maybe. Better retention as well. So someone mentioned about sickness absence, but it absolutely affects things like retention. And if we think about that in real terms, if you feel valued by your team, if you feel like your opinions are valued, you understand how others will collaborate with you to achieve those team goals, then you're much more likely to stay with the team. But if you don't feel able to express your views, you don't feel you've got that autonomy to be able to influence the team or to input into team conversations, then that can lead to that pressure, which could lead to things like sickness absence, but could also lead to an individual wanting to move away from that team because they don't feel comfortable or don't feel valued in that team. And then ultimately, what a lot of the research behind this shows in NHS environments is it can lead to improve patient care because our teams are working better together. We get teams where people understand the different perspectives in the group, and they can provide that consistently good care to the patients that they provide. So I guess the challenge, if psychological safety isn't present, then somebody might not be raising a concern about patient care, so the team doesn't have that opportunity to improve or to rectify something that might be an issue in patient care. So we absolutely want to get this right for the sakes of our patients, is what underpins all this, really. Next question I want to throw out there to the room. From your experience using TED, and you might want to think about the themes that are in the TED survey, or maybe specific questions or situations you've been through with teams. How do we know from TED when psychological safety is present? So are there things in there that maybe indicate to you that, yeah, there is psychological safety, or maybe there isn't psychological safety? So pop your ideas in the chat, or pop your hand up if you feel you want to come in. Just a few pointers while you're thinking about those things. You might want to think about is there anything in the data that maybe shows you this? Maybe there's things in the free text comments that might be indicators, maybe some of those red flags we talked about. Is there anything in any of the particular themes that are in there? So I'm thinking about things maybe like working together, team communication, team engagement, and maybe in the response rates as well. What does that tell you about psychological safety? So just take a moment, pop your ideas in the chat, or feel free to come in. Chloe, you're first in there. So you mentioned the question around being able to raise concerns to your manager. Yeah, definitely agree that one. So that's probably the ones that's perhaps more specifically linked to psychological safety. I suppose there could be other reasons. It might not just be a psychological safety issue, but if that one is scoring low, then that suggests that someone doesn't feel comfortable raising a concern to the manager. So I think TED maybe provides that opportunity to further understand what are the reasons around that. Is it something that the manager's doing? Is it something about your processes? Is it something about the culture of the team, or something else that you're doing? So yeah, absolutely agree with that. Helen, you've put in high and quick response rate. Yeah, interesting. I think that's really good way to look at this. So higher and green averages. So sometimes, absolutely, and I think the one that I've got on the slide there, it's predominantly green. So at a first glance, it might suggest to you this is a really positive team. There's no concerns, but sometimes people might not have been as open and honest as you would like them to have been in TED. So that could be a sign. If the TED survey feels a bit disconnected from what you're actually seeing when you're in the team, or what you're actually experiencing, then that could be a sign that actually team members are just maybe saying what they think people want to hear in that, or what the manager wants to hear, maybe. Michaela, you mentioned response rate might be higher with psychological safety, and the responses may show variety if the team are being honest. So yeah, sometimes a wider spread could mean absolutely people are being open and honest. If we've got a high uptake rate, then that suggests people are engaging with something like TED, and the same with things like staff survey. So those could be signs that psychological safety is present. And I guess the flip side is also true. Wendy, you've mentioned low response rate, managers reluctant to do TED in the first place. Yeah, absolutely. So that reluctance to even ask for the feedback in the first place could be a symptom of, oh, is there really psychological safety in here, or is that manager creating that environment where you can have open conversations if they're maybe unwilling to get into some of those difficult conversations. So definitely we see that quite a lot with NHS teams. Rachel, you've mentioned as well, number of people who respond. Additionally, if the scores are very high, but you've been working with the teams and aware of some concerns, so yeah, that's that disconnect sometimes. Christine, you've added the TED results are scoring high consistently, and high rates. So I guess that's if they're doing well, potentially. If there is psychological safety, then they're contributing, they're buying into it. Maybe the results are going up over time, suggest that that's something that team's building. And last but not least, Wendy, you've put in widespread of responses can indicate the possibility of cliques or favourites where some of the quieter ones are reluctant to speak their truth, potentially. Yeah, and I think that can definitely be a concern in larger teams that you get, where there might be subsections of teams, cliques, as you put it, that develop. And I do see that happen quite a lot in NHS teams, where we have quite a diverse spectrum of people that work in different teams. You might have different age groups that form their own sort of friendship groups. You might have different cultures in teams as well. And whilst those aren't necessarily something that indicates psychological safety, there is that danger that if it becomes a sort of us and them type scenario, and this can happen with team members and management teams as well, you can start to have those cliques or groups form, which mean people don't feel open to maybe challenge what the rest of their social group might feel. So I think the challenge we have from an OD perspective is that we don't get people coming to us saying, I don't feel psychologically safe. It's not that straightforward. Often we have to start to look for it and look for those signs of the things that you've been mentioning there. So things we might hear when we work with teams is things like communication isn't great. Maybe TED survey results are telling us that communication could be improved. Maybe we are hearing that people don't speak up, or maybe we're facilitating a feedback session where there's maybe one or two stronger voices in the team and other people aren't speaking up in that team. Maybe there's a challenge that, oh well, nothing ever changes, so what's the point? And I think we hear this quite often, unfortunately, and sometimes that can be a sign that people don't feel safe to suggest different ways of doing things because they feel there's no point, or it's not going to make a difference, or nobody's going to listen to me. And sometimes it might be just that feeling of pressure, the feeling that we don't want to try anything different because we're already under so much pressure that the idea of doing something outside our comfort zone would just be one step too far for us. So I think in isolation, none of these individual things can be a definite sign of psychological safety, but the sorts of things we try to do from an OD perspective is to investigate to see if there are multiple of these red flags, as I put them, showing that there's an issue in this team culture. There's something going on which we perhaps need to work on or try and unpack a little bit with the team. So just coming back to the session I ran for our internal team leads, I called Building Psychological Safety. But when I was reflecting for this session, I thought it's not actually as simple as those building blocks. We need to put in place the environment to encourage things like trust, like fairness, like inclusion. We need to create accountability across different people in our team. So that's creating team environments where it's not just the team leader who's taking accountability for everything, and where the actions that we come out of something like TED with are things that everybody can get involved with, and where we can encourage meaningful conversations where multiple people can contribute and feel part of that discussion around how are we going to approach this as a team, as a group of people. So this is where it links in really closely with TED, and it's really these sorts of things which are TED toolkits, which the actual TED conversation, the feedback process, the continuous improvement process. This is what it's all built up to help teams work on. So through an OD practitioner lens, the sorts of things that we do is, rather than jumping straight to a solution, let's think, how can we fix this? What do we need to do? What we would do, and what, because we work with multiple teams, we sort of get used to this as we see different team dynamics. We start to ask those curious questions. So we'll be asking things like, rather than focusing on who is speaking, we might be trying to notice who's not speaking, whose view have I not got here? How can I make sure that I do get that balanced view from across a team or a situation? When there is agreement, is that genuine, or is it people just complying because they see something as maybe a tick box exercise, or we've just got to comply with this? Otherwise it'll mean we get more work on the back of it. Are they really giving open and honest answers? I think we're often looking for. Sometimes we'll be reflecting on silence. Sometimes that might just be, you do have quieter members in teams, and different people's personalities will contribute in different ways. But as OD practitioners, we often sort of think about that and think, actually, is it because there's fear of contributing, or is it just that those individuals need that time and space to reflect? Are we creating the environment which gives those types of personalities the opportunity to, I guess, process the information that they're working on? Next one, is it productive or is it personal? So when there is conflict, is it directed at individuals, or is it about offering constructive challenge? Is it about thinking around how can we sort of challenge the status quo maybe, or change the ways that we're doing things in a positive way? Is it linked to that team purpose or that patient outcome, whatever it is that a team might be working on? And then in terms of when we think about energy, we're looking around, okay, what's creating that energy? What might be draining that energy in a team? So we encourage, or when we approach teams, these are the sorts of things we keep an eye out for from an OD lens. And these are the sorts of behaviours we want to encourage in our team leaders through TED. So a lot of the toolkits that we create are really trying to distill these things down into structured ways that team leaders can ask these sorts of questions and be able to have that sort of curious approach to be able to create psychological safety in the team. So on the next few slides, I've got a few sort of approaches that team leaders can use. So what I'd encourage you to do, following today's session, as always, I'll send out a link to the video and the slide deck from today's session, but have a think around how you can encourage your team leaders to do this. Feel free to share these slides with them. But I've sort of come up with these 5 factors of things that team leaders can do. So ways that they can observe what's going on, ways that they can reflect situations both to their teams but also reflect on their own contributions. How can they invite contributions from others as well? How can they normalize that approach around I guess constructive conversations, where conflict is in some ways is welcomed, but as long as it is in the right way and it is in that structured way that the team is I guess resilient to and able to work with. And then also try to encourage that process of reframing, something that we often do in coaching, trying to get people see things from different perspectives. But if we can instill these sorts of skills in our team leaders, then that can help them reframe things both from their own perspective and for their team members as well. So the first one we've got is around observe, and some of the things you might suggest to your team leaders to ask, and these can be things they ask as part of the TED discussion, are things like this. I'm noticing a few different reactions to this. It's about suggesting things like, it feels like we've gone a little bit quieter, so calling out the things that you're seeing. There seems to be a lot of agreement. I'm wondering if there are any other perspectives. So acknowledging before taking action, but also acknowledging that there are different perspectives and creating that space for people to be able to give different perspectives and welcoming them, I guess. Another one at the bottom there, I noticed several people nodded when that was mentioned. Would someone care to unpack that a little bit, or to put into words what they're feeling when they hear that or when they see those TED results? So when you do that, team leaders might be looking out for, okay, who's speaking first? Is there anybody that hasn't spoken? When does the energy change? Are there particular topics which really change the energy in the room? What topics do create enthusiasm and perhaps really uplift the energy? Is there anything that people are hesitant to get into? And final point there, are people building on ideas or avoiding them? So if something's suggested, do people then want to get into why an idea might work, or even why it won't work? Or are they just sort of listening to it and staying quiet because they're not really going to buy into it as they work forward? Next one was around reflecting. So phrases that team leaders might use: what I'm hearing is this, this, this. It sounds as though X, Y, Z. Several people have mentioned this topic, or the common thread seems to be this thing. So by doing that, team leaders can call out the themes that they are hearing from a TED conversation, maybe, or what people are reflecting on after they've looked at the TED results, maybe. And that then gives team leaders that opportunity to say, have I understood this correctly? Or is there a different way of interpreting what we've been talking about there? Is there anything that I've missed or that we've missed as a team when we've been having that team conversation? Would anyone describe it differently? And I think the strength of being able to do something like this is it can ensure that everybody in the room is on the same page in terms of their understanding. And if there are different ways of interpreting what's being said, let's hear those and let's factor that into our decision-making process before we turn it into an action plan. Next one, around inviting. Useful phrases to use might be who has a different perspective. So creating that culture where it's okay, we expect to have different perspectives. I think a TED report can help to do this because it'll show you on that range of responses that you've got if there are people who disagree with the topic, if there are people who strongly agree. And what I do in the TED conversation is encourage those different voices to come forward and give their perspective on why they might have answered different parts of the scale. What are we not hearing yet? So if something hasn't been talked about, but your TED data is suggesting that it's a concern, throw that question out to try and encourage people to come forward or give their interpretations of what might be set in your TED data. Questions like, I'd love to hear from someone who hasn't spoken, can be I guess a gentle way of welcoming people who haven't had that chance to input into the conversation. Or what would someone outside our team notice? That sort of gives team members that license to be able to answer from a different perspective than their own, and maybe put themselves in a different position or look at it through a different lens. And final point there, if this was working brilliantly, what would be different? So I guess it's challenging the team to say, okay, we've talked a lot about where we are, what our situation is, maybe what our TED results are saying, but what does good look like? I guess we're asking here, what's that team that we want to be in the future? Who do we aspire to be? And what are the things that would make that a reality? So when you use those sorts of questions, what we're doing is encouraging our team to, or team leaders to be curious. It's not about being certain, it's about asking those curious questions. It's about exploring a topic, definitely before coming up with actions. And I think this is a skill to learn for team leaders. I often, especially when I work with team leaders for the first time, there's always that wanting to fix a problem. I'm not sure if it applies to every team or whether it's just an NHS thing, but we tend to be sort of hardwired to wanting to come up with a solution, because we want things to be better. It's coming from a good place. But the challenge is if we miss those steps in between, we might not bring the team along with us. So we want to encourage that that approach of questions over assumptions, make sure we've got the full picture, we've got all those different perspectives before we start to come towards actions? Can we encourage exploring a topic? And it's not about debate, it's not about one side versus the other, it's not a sort of red side versus blue side, it's not about football or anything like that. It's about, you know, what do we understand about our particular situation? So next one, a couple more of these. So normalize. So what I'm getting at with normalize is normalizing that it's okay to have different perspectives. So types of phrases that team leaders might use, it's okay if we see this differently. Different experiences are completely normal. So highlighting that we all perhaps have slightly different roles in our team, so we will have different perspectives. You'll definitely have different personal backgrounds in the team. You might have different age groups represented, you'll have different professional disciplines, so it's absolutely normal to have different perspectives and different experiences. Normalizing the idea that we don't have to agree. It's not about everybody agreeing on the way forward and saying this is the direction we're going in. And in fact, something I would encourage teams to do is be open to saying, okay, we don't quite agree, we're going to choose this course of action, but we're not wedded to that. We're going to try it, and it's going to be one of those tiny experiments that we do between now and when we next do TED. And then we're going to reflect on it. And if it hasn't worked, we'll try something different, because we've got that learning culture in our team. Next on there, it's useful to understand why our experiences differ. So it's about unpacking the detail that sits behind differences of opinion. So what's influencing these different opinions? We need to understand that before we can decide which direction we want to try first. And then last one, there's no right answers here. So, you know, we've all done that in sessions we've been in or that we've run, said, oh, there's no such thing as a silly question, but it's really trying to sort of foster that culture where it's okay to ask a question or to have an answer which might be wrong, you know. And if someone else comes back at your suggestion and says, oh, well, we tried that 5-10 years ago and it didn't work, that's okay. We can appreciate both perspectives and then maybe start to talk around, okay, what can we maybe do different than that last time when it didn't work? What might have changed between now and then, now that we understand that there is a challenge, there's a risk with an action that we're taking? How can we make sure we give it the best chance possible? So things to remember for team leaders, the goal isn't about consensus. The goal is about understanding. And the more we can understand, the more we can make those informed decisions. Okay, and last one is this idea of reframing. So I've set this one out a little bit different, but in terms of reframing, what we can encourage our team leaders to do is, first of all, it's definitely not about allocating fault. So it's about thinking, how can we learn from this situation? It doesn't do us any favors to point the finger and say, that's the person who did this wrong, or you should do something different. It's about saying, okay, what do we understand about something which maybe hasn't worked or something that's gone wrong, and how can we create a situation where we don't get that wrong in future? And I think most importantly, when we're having a TED style team conversation, how can we all be part of creating that environment where we can learn and build on mistakes? Sometimes you might get that pushback in team conversations where people say, oh, this always happens, or you know, it'll never change. So we can then start to ask questions to unpack that. So okay, so why have things not changed in the past? When does it work well? What can we learn about the occasions when it's not worked well? And again, it's about understanding before taking action. Next one, instead of asking what's wrong, and I think sometimes that's the approach some team leaders might go into TED thinking about, looking just at the reds that are in there, what are our lower scores? Try and flip that conversation around. Okay, maybe we understand a bit about what's not working, but what does good look like? What do we want to aspire to? And I think that could be such a positive way of approaching a team conversation, to talk aspirationally and not get bogged down by the reasons why you're not perfect right now. Let's talk about who we want to be, and then we can work back from there by deciding, okay, what are the first steps on that journey towards that team that we aspire to be. And final one, I guess, linked directly to psychological safety. Instead of just asking, why don't people speak up, we might be asking the question, what would make it easier for people to speak up? And this might be a question that a team leader asks the team. It might be a question they ask themselves. And when we talk about creating that environment for psychological safety, it might be through things like committing to something like TED, where we've got an anonymous approach, or making sure that I do have regular one-to-ones, or I create those mechanisms which will allow psychological safety to grow. I guess rather than the analogy of building psychological safety, it's more like I don't know, planting things in a garden, wanting to encourage wildlife to come to your garden. It's not as simple as do X and Y will happen, but you can create the environment for things to grow and flourish and work in your team environment. Okay, so coming back to psychological safety, and I'll go into some of the toolkits that I'll signpost you to in a moment, but what we want to try and encourage through TED is creating team environments where everyone has a voice, where there's no blame or judgment, openness is encouraged, and also where the leader can role model that vulnerability. I seem to recently been having a lot of conversations with team leaders who've maybe felt a bit self-conscious about some of the feedback in the leadership section of TED. And something I've been trying to encourage them is actually it's a great opportunity if your leadership scores aren't perfect, which you can never be totally perfect, particularly in a complex team. It's a real opportunity to openly ask the team, okay, what do I do well about encouraging people to speak up? What maybe don't I do so well, or what would good look like from your perspective as a team? And if you can be open and vulnerable about that, then you're sort of role modeling what you want your team to be like, and being open to admitting that you're not perfect, that you do perhaps not get it right 100% of the time. But also it's important in these conversations to ground the team in reality of actually what's practically possible, because often team members might have unrealistic expectations of the team leader. So if you can use TED as a platform to try and ground the team in actually what can we realistically do, then that can help that relationship as well. So I guess I'll not go into these in too much detail, but what we want to do through TED, the whole ethos of TED really, is trying to create a situation where teams co-create the solutions to the challenges that they have. I often describe it as wanting teams to feel that TED's something there for them and with them, rather than being done to them. So it's about a collaborative approach. We also encourage through TED creating small but realistic actions. It's not going to revolutionize the way your team works in one TED cycle. And the more manageable the actions that you create from TED, the more likely that you are to stick with them, and the more likely they are to be something which your team can continue with over time. And the idea is, because you're coming back to it again and again, you've got that agreed shared ownership in the team, that you can follow up with it and then build on those initial actions that you've created, so you get better over time. Another slide just from a team leader's perspective that might be worth sharing: things to consider before, during and after your TED survey. So from a team leader's perspective, things you can do to try and encourage psychological safety: be really clear on your intention of why you're doing TED, what's it for, how you're going to use it. Prepare for some of those emotions that might come up, and that's where some of the toolkits might help if you feel there is going to be a tricky conversation, or where that's where they might come to the likes of ourselves in the room for coaching support maybe, or a bit of advice on how do I deal with a particular topic. During the session, we want to encourage team leaders to balance the different voices, make sure there are no dominating sort of perspectives in the room, and that every side of a story is told, but don't be afraid to also slow the conversation down to really, I guess, deep dive, but also give people space to reflect on what they're seeing in the TED report, or what those actions might mean for the team in reality. And then I guess a big part of the success in this, and where sort of the make or break in it, is making sure you follow through with it. So that whatever you've talked about in your team conversation, you keep checking back in on it, you keep momentum with it, and at some point you repeat the TED process, and it becomes part of that cycle, so that team members see how that conversation you had at the start is sort of having that regularly. It's regularly embedded throughout what we do as a team. So just wanted to sort of signpost. I haven't created any new toolkits this month. I've really wanted to just highlight some of the great ones we've got in there already around psychological safety. So the first one to show you is the quadrant exercise. Some of you might have used this, but this is a really good one for getting a sense check of where people feel on psychological safety. It could be something you could maybe do on a whiteboard, get people to pop post-it notes on the whiteboard, but it helps the team think around what is their level of psychological safety, what's their level of motivation. And I guess the ideal situation is where we've got a really motivated team, or and a really high we're really high on psychological safety. The danger, I think, sometimes for teams is they often, rather than necessarily being low on both of these, and that's the danger, will slip into that sort of bottom left quadrant. I think quite often I see in NHS teams that they might fall into that anxiety side because they have motivation, they're absolutely driven to want the best patient outcomes, but because psychological safety is low, it creates increased stress, increased anxiety. And I guess it's that sort of we've got a resource on moral injury and that sort of inner conflict that you might have, and it's similar to that. It's about when someone feels that pressure to want to get the best patient outcomes, but also that competing pressure that they don't have an avenue for being able to make that happen, or it feels like, you know, they're stuck in the way they work on it. So that sort of highlights why we want to create psychological safety. There is, of course, the risk that teams could go the other way. You might have really high psychological safety but low motivation. So if we don't have that I guess constructive challenge, that ability to sort of push each other, the danger is a team would move more into that comfort zone without actually performing to a high level, because there isn't enough positive challenge, I guess, in a team. So this exercise is a really good way of trying to talk about that topic with the team. Next one is about creating trust and psychological safety. So it gives a step-by-step guide to things a team could put in place. And I guess this one is designed to be a bit of a team discussion around, okay, what do we already do that helps us create trust? And what things could we maybe put in place? So it's got things like, what ground rules could we set to create an environment of trust? It can be a good one, this, to do at the start of a TED conversation, to say, what are our ground rules going to be for this conversation? It's that idea that if we co-create those ground rules, we're all approaching it in the right spirit. Useful thing to do can be to actually define what trust means. I know when a few of you commented in the chat, trust is something that absolutely is a big part of psychological safety. But again, I think sometimes that can be an ambiguous term, that to one person, what trust actually means might be slightly different to another person's perspective. So if you can define that as a team, saying, actually, what does it mean to us? Is it about creating space so that people can share, that they can openly talk? Is it about actively listening? What are the things we can do to create trust? And then also it's around exploring the current state. You might do that through TED or using that quadrant exercise, and then only then, when you've built that up, starting to move towards your action plan. Final toolkit I've got for you is the psychological contract. So this has been in TED for a while. I think we often talk about contracts as being something that's a written thing, like a job description, a policy, terms and conditions. But actually, the reality around psychological contracts is, again, it's open to people's perspectives. So it can be really difficult when different people might have different expectations of what actually constitutes support, what constitutes fairness in our team, how do we develop ourselves, those sorts of things. So it gets teams talking about what are those things that we can do. So in the bubble that I've put, psychological safety doesn't just come from team conversations. Just because you're having those conversations doesn't mean you'll automatically have psychological safety, but it's about creating an environment so people feel that they've got a fair deal, that things are consistent, that the work is being shared across the team. So this exercise encourages teams to reflect on that from their own perspective. Okay, just conscious of time, coming to the end. So in terms of how this fits in with TED, I guess, and I think my next slide sort of expands on this a bit, but what we want teams to do, it can start with TED. I think TED is that useful snapshot. Your first TED, as always, is just that baseline. It doesn't necessarily give you the answers. It tells you what's that current situation and something that we can build on. It's the conversation that actually allows you to start to build on that. And by having those meaningful conversations, you're starting to create that trust. And it's not to say that just one TED will get you there. Each time you go through it, you're building an extra layer onto that trust and that confidence that's in the team. So the idea is, through doing that, we create that shared commitment together, we reinforce that shared purpose and create that safe environment where we're all safe in the knowledge that we all want that same outcome, even if we do have different opinions of how we get there. And ultimately, that leads to high performance, to continuous improvement, shared learning as things around us evolve and situations develop. So, in summary, psychological safety is built through everyday conversations. It's about encouraging people to collaborate, to communicate, and TED is one way that you can do that. It's by no means the only way, but it can be part of creating that positive culture within teams, and it can ensure that the sorts of questions the team is asking are about the things that the team really cares about. And also, the thing I wanted to get across today is that small leadership behaviours can have a big influence on team culture. So those slides with prompts, feel free to use those. Definitely share them with your team leaders. I think I might turn some of those into a TED Toolkit as well, and have a sort of go-to list of curious questions that team leaders might ask as well. Okay, if you could give us feedback, I will find the link and post it through afterwards. I realise, Lindsay, I haven't shared this with you to pop in the chat, but if you want to give us feedback on today's session, we always welcome your views. Let us know if it's been helpful, if there are any other topics you'd like us to deep dive into in future sessions, and to signpost you to our next couple of sessions. So next month's Lunch and Learn is on the 18th of August. I'm going to be covering what happens when you do have that disconnect, maybe with your TED results, and what you're feeling in the team, or what other things might be saying to you. And then, as always, we've got quarterly deep dive coming up around staff survey as we get to that time in September as well. But thank you all for your time. It's been lovely to see you all this afternoon, and have a lovely weekend. We'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.